Thank you to the Mahoney and Raftery Wealth Management team of Raymond James, as well as these season sponsors and donors like you who make Colorado MahlerFest possible. Please consider supporting the festival during this year-end giving season. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ken Woods, Artistic Director of Colorado MahlerFest, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome filmmaker Jason Starr. Hi, Jason.
Good to see you, Kenneth.
Well, likewise. It's fun to turn around and point the camera at you for a change. Mahler nuts, and let's face it, no one who's not a Mahler nut is going to watch this. Will be aware of your body of work over the last, nearly 20 years, I would say, making films about the music of Gustav Mahler. I mean, it's interesting with Mahler that, like Wagner, he was a giganticist who invites gigantic responses. And if you think of the scope of Henri Louis de Lagrange's biographies, and here you find yourself in a different medium, in a multi-decade project exploring his music. And you've only now just gotten to the beginning of his symphonic cycle. I have two questions to start out with. First, why Mahler? What about Mahler drew you into this? And when you began, did you think you would still be doing it in 2020?
Yeah, well, the second part I could easily answer. At the time that I discovered Mahler, I had no idea I'd become a filmmaker. But I was about 12 years old and had already made contact with Beethoven, which was a revelation. I mean, it was just one of those kids in a general music class. When the teacher would turn around, I'd take a pen and put a little spitball in them and, hit the back of some pretty girl up front. And then the teacher put on Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and said, what's amazing about this is that the entire first movement is the three Gs in an E flat. It just keeps coming up in all sorts of permutations. I heard that and was just amazed. Also, everybody in that class was quiet for that whole, I mean, it really had an impact, not just on me. So my parents thought, oh, great, Jason likes classical music. We'll get a stereo. We didn't have a stereo. So we got a stereo and it came with a record to show off high fidelity sound. And on that record was a movement from somebody I never heard of, Gustav Mahler, the scherzo of the First Symphony. That was like one of the showpieces. So I listened to that and thought, this is great. This is so wonderful. So I ran out and bought a recording of the First Symphony and fell in love with that. Then I just went up to the Second Symphony. And when I was listening to the scherzo of the Second Symphony, again, this is a 12-year-old, and I'm hearing this wonderful lyrical dance music in the third movement. And then all of a sudden, this eruption. This struck me like a, to quote Mahler, like a bolt of lightning, in that this music means something. It's not just pretty, engaging, inviting dance music in this particular case, but that there's something else deeper going on. And that just fascinated me. That sent me on my way.
And how did you end up finding your way into filmmaking? I love filmmaking because it's possibly an even more unlikely profession than conducting. I mean, it's certainly right up there, sort of things that parents never want to hear their kids say they're going to do when they grow up. Did you decide fairly early on, or did you sort of slip into it by accident?
100% the latter. I had no concept that I would be a filmmaker when I was younger. I wanted to be a composer. And in fact, that's what I studied as both an undergraduate and graduate, music composition. And I was teaching for several years when I was approached and asked if I would get involved in a startup film management company. And I thought, well, I don't want to be a manager. They said, well, I was, I think, 24 at the time. We'll offer you twice what you're being paid now and the right of first refusal to compose film scores to any documentaries that we make. So I figured, what do I have to lose?
What do I have to lose, indeed?
That just happened to be the time when cable TV was coming into its own. And there was this notion that arts programming could be a big component of cable television. And so you had ABC Arts and Entertainment come into existence, Bravo, which at the time was strictly performing arts, and CBS Cable, which only lasted a year, was dedicated to the arts. So I figured, well, I can do this. I'll write my own proposal. I got a meeting with Bravo, and they, after a few more sessions with them, handed me this big check and said, do it. And so I made some programs with the Emerson String Quartet and with Dan Wagner and dancers, and I caught the bug. And so that was quite a while ago. And since then, I've done several series for PBS, including Backstage Lincoln Center, where I was making short-ish documentaries that would be broadcast prior to a Live from Lincoln Center. And we did one segment on Mahler, in fact, on the funeral march to the First Symphony that Kurt Masur was about to conduct with the Philharmonic. And I was continuously encouraged to popularize my ideas. And of course, that's understandable. But I had a yearning to make the kind of film that I wanted to make that wasn't being asked to be dumbed down, so to speak. Yeah. There is this prevailing attitude that in order to lure people into classical music, it needed to be fun and entertaining, bubbly.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, there's enough people out there that read seriously, that are open to artistic experiences, if you can make it available to them in a way that is both educating, but also gripping. So other circumstances conspired to my directing a performance of Mahler's Third Symphony, and that was my first Mahler documentary.
Nun aber denke dir so ein großes Werk.
Imagine a work so large that it mirrors the entire world.
So said Gustav Mahler, a visionary composer who sought to create a new kind of music of such immensity and scope that it could invoke the very forces that created the cosmos.
I had no intention at the time that this would become a series or a cycle of documentaries, but that was well received, and I managed to get additional financial support for some more, and that's where we are.
Amazing. Now, I gather in the process of getting this project started, there is a connection with Colorado MahlerFest. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and I think it's a lesson for other filmmakers and actually just for life in general. I had this performance that I filmed of Mahler 3, and now I wanted to make a documentary. Well, documentaries or any film costs money, and not being sure how to go about this other than the obvious, you apply for grants and that takes forever. I decided to use some of my own money, and I went to the UK to interview Donald Mitchell and Peter Franklin and one or two others back in the States. And I put together a sample reel of what this could be. I was then invited by the Colorado MahlerFest. They were performing the Third Symphony that year to speak as part of the symposium and to show these excerpts. In the audience was someone who became a very dear friend, who directed a foundation and offered to help with the film and ended up helping a lot with the film. And that's really how the first one came into being. So I'm ever appreciative of the Colorado MahlerFest for that, certainly. But of course, a long-term relationship developed with that festival that you are now director of, which led to premieres of the ensuing Mahler documentaries. And that's always been great because of the audience that you attract, which is a very thirsty, curious, knowledgeable audience that really appreciates anything to do with Mahler.
Yes, they are all of that. It's interesting this year. Of course, we are just heartbroken to have not had a festival in the spring this year, but we are finding that thirsty Mahler loving group of people includes many who can't get to Colorado in the spring, of course, and being able to expand into the digital realm is, in many ways, it's been a really useful step forward for the festival as a whole. I want to talk a little bit now about your latest film, Mahler's Titan: The Romance, Death, and Triumph of a Young Musician. And I sort of joked about this at the beginning, but it's taken you a while to come around to the First Symphony, which I suppose of all his works does have the most complex and lengthy gestation of anything. Was that the reason for waiting until now, or what was the reason to tackle it at this point in your trajectory?
The first three were not purely instrumental symphonies. Started with number 3.
And this human voice starts to become consciousness itself.
In the fourth movement of his Third Symphony, Mahler moves beyond the pre-conscious world of the forest. Now he takes us to a midnight dream. Here, matter questions itself. It is a new beginning.
Went to number 2.
We stand by the coffin of a beloved person. His life, struggles, passions, and aspirations pass before our mind's eye. And now, in this serious, most deeply moving moment, when we strip off like a cover all that confuses us, a terrible, solemn voice, which we continually ignore in the deafening activity of the day, seizes upon our heart. What now?
Then to Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth.
What Mahler is doing is really setting up an operatic scene. We don't know precisely who the audience for this singer is, but we sense that what we're being confronted with here is something like a court jester or a clown or the drunken poet, who is a good poet, but is also good for a laugh because he's usually had one too many.
All of which had not only texts sung, at least in some part of the symphony, but a relatively clear philosophical program. And it's that philosophical program, it's the world of ideas that I think Mahler captures musically more than any other composer. So the first symphony is the first of the purely symphonic works. It always was beckoning to me because it was the first exposure I ever had to Mahler. To a young kid, to a 12, 13, 14-year-old, hearing the first movement, Spring Without End, and you hear music that just amazingly captures the emotional world that I was inhabiting at the time.
The symphony captures the exuberant striving of youth. Just as youth becomes aware of something beyond itself, something revelatory, all this drama is not just about one exceptional individual. It's life itself bursting through. Life with all of its potential, its challenges, its immensity.
The whole work, of course, is a masterpiece. To a teenager, the finale is one of those blow your speakers apart type of finale. And, just what could be more yummy.
All of a sudden, there is a shift. With a little break in between, called in German a Luftpause, the music stops.
I was a little hesitant because before the first film that I did on the Third Symphony, there really weren't films about Mahler that focused on specific pieces of music. There were some wonderful films about Mahler more generally, biographically, but none that just looked at a particular work. Here, by the time I got to the First Symphony, there already was a film, a wonderful documentary featuring Michael Tilson Thomas that spends the first 40 minutes looking at the First Symphony. So I was thinking, well, it's already been done. Why engage the same topic? But I became persuaded that what MTT was investigating, which again was more biographical, was something that I could reference quickly and get on with the journey of the music from a programmatic perspective. And in all honesty, I don't know if I would have done this or could have pulled it off were it not for the discovery of a new document that really is like a Rosetta Stone of understanding the First Symphony in particular and Mahler's approach to program music more generally.
Tell us a little bit about this discovery, because this is really an amazing thing, especially, that it's remained hidden in plain view for so long.
Yes, in the final years of Henri Louis de Lagrange's work on Mahler, where he was revising his first volume, the early years up through the first two symphonies, he had the assistance of a great Mahler scholar in her own right, Sibylle Werner. And she shared with me this newspaper article that was published the day before the world premiere in Budapest. Little citations of this appeared in other people's volumes and appears in the original Henri Louis first volume, but not in its entirety. And it just wasn't available. So I got this, and it is eye-opening because, you know, Mahler later in life made this famous statement about, you know, no more programs, I despise programs. And a lot of people, very understandably, don't want to have a preconceived notion of what this music might be about when experiencing it for themselves. More than legitimate, an absolutely great way, and probably the best way to first experience a great work of art is to just let it take you in, let it shower you in what it has to offer, and you take it in your own terms.
Yes, I call this the car radio test in a way, you know, that if you're driving, you turn on the radio, you don't know what the piece is, you don't know who the performers are. Mm-hmm. If a piece can really grab you and take you on a journey, I think that's the test of a great musical work. You know, that you don't need to know who it is, the backstory of the composer, the circumstances. You don't have to read the program notes. But, you know, when you get to your house, you park the car and you sit to the end of the piece to find out what it is you've been listening to. But on the other hand, once, just like you want to get to the end of the piece and find out what it is you've been listening to, then I think the hunger to know why it affected you as it did and something more about how it came to be is really, really fascinating. And hence I think these programs, in a way, they're less necessary for us as listening tools and more helpful for us in terms of understanding Mahler's creative process and what he was trying to say.
Yes, obviously I agree with you since this is what I do. So, so having said, first of all, you put that beautifully, the car radio test. But then, you know, as again, a teenager, I'm reading the back of these record jackets that reference these titles, and that's pretty much all. Maybe a description that Mahler had published about the work of art that inspired the funeral march, the Hunter's Funeral Procession by Moritz von Schwind. But that's it. And so after a lifetime of reading, like you have done, I had the great benefit of coming into contact with this newspaper article that, that basically lays it all out.
Drawing from this sound world, Mahler composed a symphony that he hoped to be as rich in feeling and meaning as life itself. Before the premiere, he shared his thoughts with a journalist.
A symphony can take on aspects of texted music through tone painting. An artist can tell entire stories through such means, and even convey the spirit of philosophical speculation.
And of course, yes, this is early Mahler. This is Mahler in 1888. He has yet to write his remaining symphonies. But while the Fifth Symphony on may be less literal, I mean, they don't have texted portions with the exception of the Eighth and Das Lied. And he doesn't offer program titles like he did for the early symphonies. His technique and what he is going for is still informed by this generative notion of what a modern symphony, what a new symphony can be. And it certainly springs from the Wagnerian concept of Gesamtkunstwerk. of something fully comprehensive, creating a world. And so, I can get into specifics about this, and I suppose that I should. But of course, this is what the film does, and the film, unlike me as a secondary source and a talking head, the film has many other elements. Most importantly, the music, which is wonderfully conducted by Naomi Yarvi. And also dramatizations and artwork and all sorts of other visual elements. And visual elements are very important in a film. Not obviously, it's a visual format, but you don't want to, as an audience member, just be talked to. Just, the ideas, as rich as they are, need moments for you to gestate, for you to really take in. And visuals can further the development of ideas without talking at you.
Let's pick up with this idea of the visuals, because they really struck me in this film as, in a way, a bigger part of this one than the previous ones, and there's so much in it that's kind of really wonderful and whimsical and engaging, like the way you animate the huntsman's funeral and stuff.
This came to me from the satirical picture familiar to all Austrian children, the huntsman's funeral. All around, the forest glimmers green, the hares are dancing, the stags merrily pull the hearse upon which the dead hunter is laid out.
Tell me a little bit about how some of these sort of animated images came to be, and was that something you've been working towards for a while?
The incorporation of visual elements is a challenge. As a filmmaker, I wanted, on the one hand, a rich palette of visual options. On the other hand, you don't want it to be a smorgasbord of a little of this and a little of that, and it not coming together. So I decided on a gestalt. I should say we decided on a gestalt because this was with the director of photography, who is responsible for lighting or working with the lighting designer for the performance, this symphonic rendering of the work that we filmed. And I wanted the mood that we established there to be a consistent thread. So a major element of that is the color gold, and fire plays an important part in the program. Even though he doesn't talk about fire, he does talk about hell to paradise. And this hell, of course, is a psychological hell. It's not the mythological hell of where you go if you're bad. And so we begin the film with Mahler composing with an explosion of fire, because this is what he's working on so feverishly.
In 1888, a 27-year-old Gustav Mahler had the ambition to compose a new kind of music.
And that really isn't explained until we get towards the end of the film and we become more familiar with the program and where Mahler is taking us on this dramatic journey.
Without going too far into the program, just talk a little bit about Titan itself and what that title means and how your understanding of the term itself has changed through this recently discovered news source. It's always been assumed that this was a reference to Jean-Paul, and you say yes, and there's more.
Yes, and I don't think that the title Titan is a reference to Jean-Paul, although I think Jean-Paul's novel Titan, and I know this is tough to swallow, is an influence on the symphony, but it's not an influence on what is titanic about the symphony, which we encounter in the finale, this battle, this storm, but rather on the preceding movement, the funeral march. And we know this because of conversations that Bruno Walter had with Mahler about this, that we can find in Bruno Walter's book on Mahler. And he talks about having a conversation with Mahler about the character Roquerolles.
Roquerolles in the novel is an embodiment of a particular type, a romantic genius who has all of the wonderful attributes of a romantic artist, and that he is very much in touch with his emotions and creates art drawn from his own experiences. But he also embodies some of the negative stereotypes of the romantic artist, in that he is so completely self-involved and narcissistic that all of life that he experiences must somehow be projected into his art. Roquerolles stages his own suicide in the novel. He performs a play and shoots himself on stage.
For Mahler to take that in as brilliantly as he does and identify it with himself as someone who's gone through this struggle and sees where it can go, which would be very destructive and lead to very mediocre art, or to rise above that and emerge from a composer of romantic, rhapsodic music into a composer for the ages. This is the struggle of the protagonist in the symphony that has so much to do with this particular character from Jean-Paul's Titan.
Can I just pick up on that for a second, because it's very, very interesting, and something that occurred to me really for the first time as you were saying that is that, of course, one of my all-time least favorite terms that one often hears next to Mahler's name is neurotic. You know, as if he was sort of a borderline mental patient most of his life. And people forget, you know, he was a very highly accomplished professional person in a high-stress job. You know, he ran theaters, he planned budgets. He was, you know, very much a strong character. And when you think about this sort of turning away from the cliche of a sort of self-destructive romantic artist, the comparison that comes to mind is actually with his childhood friend Hans Roth, and having seen the example of a young composer of genius who in a way almost played out the line that you're explaining from Titan there, that, you know, Mahler's seen that he has, the struggle for him is to not take that path, and to find that sort of inner steel to make himself the best artist he could possibly be, rather than just a romantic tale of excess and wasted talent.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just have a huge problem by associating the word neurotic to Mahler, because it's just so inappropriate and so wrong. Should we say that he was a calm, balanced person? What creative person is always a calm, balanced person? This man, as a child, lost 6 siblings before he even went to school, to college, to the conservatory. the presence of coffins was common in his household as a child. You don't just ignore that, and or you do, and you become neurotic, or you come to grips with this. I mean, this is one of the astonishing things about Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, Songs of a Wayfarer. This notion of various paths to dealing with trauma. And in the first symphony, the trauma is the facing of a meaningless universe of you're a thoughtful person. Faith isn't part of your habit, part of what you've grown up with, something that you accept readily. And yet you do have some sort of faith. I mean, you do have some identification with, at least with nature as a form of divinity, of the creative act as a form of divinity. And so this conundrum, this philosophical dilemma of how to make sense of this. I mean, this is Mahler's world, how to make sense of life. And so he taps this literary connection with Jean-Paul, but also, and this is where the film takes us, and I hate to give it away, that there were other titans in Mahler's life. One brought to him by his closest friend, a friend with whom he had endless philosophical conversations for decades, and that he looked up to, Mahler did, as a mentor, and that's Siegfried Lippener, a poet who established himself at the age of 18 by writing an epic poem that generated praise and responses by Richard Wagner, by Friedrich Nietzsche. That was basically the toast of the German-speaking world. And that very work lays down the inspiration for a mythic figure that grapples with these issues as Mahler, as a young man, as an artist, and as we all in our own way must come to grips with. And so if the title Titan has meaning for Mahler, which clearly it did, since he dubbed the symphonic poem by that name, this, I think, sheds more light on what he was going after.
Ultimately, Prometheus has this vision that we can bail this out if he's willing to redeem humanity with his death. Prometheus is consumed by an ocean of fire in order to be able to help humanity for the second time.
One thing that I find fascinating about the piece is the very last thing he did, practically, was to call it a symphony in the creative process. That was sort of the final step. And yet, you know, whereas if you look at any of the later works, as you have already, you're talking about the story of that piece, you know, the creation of the Third Symphony, the writing of Das Lied von der Erde. In this case, you're talking about the invention of the Mahler symphony as an archetype itself, you know, something that didn't exist before. And although his language would grow and his subject matter would change somewhat over the years, essentially by the end of this very complicated process, which didn't even necessarily start out as a symphony, he's defined what a Mahler symphony is, and everything that is to come, you know, is basically now there, finished and perfected down to a T.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it is so true. This, what he accomplished here is, you know, to use words like amazing or dumbfounding are just too small he invented a new kind of symphony. And that he didn't know that it was a symphony yet, I think actually, I'm not so sure of that. I mean, there's a political element to whether you call a work a symphony or a symphonic poem. This is something that came from discussions I've had with Peter Franklin, who's very interested in this subject, which is the politics of music. Did Mahler want to identify himself with the young German avant-garde who were all writing symphonic poems? Or did he want to ingratiate himself with the more powerful Austrian critics who were following Brahms and more classical structures? So there's that in itself could be a book. But in terms of the invention of his musical language, I mean, the deployment of suggestive but ambiguous movement titles and section titles, the use of sound symbols that are multivalent, you know, that could imply this but could also imply that. So he's not locking you in to, oh, it's a bird, yeah, but also, you know, is it nature? Is it freedom? Is it a contrast to how we live our own lives? His references to works of literature, which we already talked about, and visual arts, which in this particular case, the woodcut by von Schninn. All of this adds to a narrative of sorts, but that by necessity, because of its ambition to include so much of the human experience, must remain mysterious and suggestive rather than getting bogged down in telling a singular story. So it's a rich world, to say the least. And it's a joy and privilege to be able to explore this in cinematographic terms, because, you know, I'm constantly discovering as going along. And that provides me with a kinship with Mahler, who I think, and this is probably one of the most extraordinary things about the First Symphony. If someone was to ask me, what is it about? You know, I hate to say what a Mahler said, to reduce it to what it's about. But for argument's sake, for conversational sake, I would say it's a coming of age symphony. And I know how flat that sounds and how pathetic that sounds. It is a coming of age in that it is a creative artist realizing what personal growth is necessary in order to not only create great art, but to come to terms with life and all of its challenges. And in the First Symphony, he, as its protagonist, is learning this as he's composing it, which is incredible. It's not like he sits down and he says, I know exactly what I want to do, and I'm going to do it. He sits down and in possibly some hypnagogic state comes to terms with his feelings, and lo and behold, we see what's struggles he is going through, and that is the struggle of our protagonist in the symphony.
That's so well said, Jason. I couldn't agree more. One last thing I want to talk about just very briefly is that, of course, the integration of song and symphony in Mahler is something that sets him apart from almost all other symphonists. I mean, in Schumann, there's important examples of him quoting Beethoven songs and stuff in his symphonies. But, you know, with Mahler, you have the self-quotation, which is incredibly important. And the most obvious example is actually the First Symphony and the Wayfarer songs. And it occurred to me as you were speaking just now that part of this journey of becoming and coming back to the question of the sort of, you know, not falling into the Hans Rott trap is in the Wayfarer songs, you have a body of musical material that tells a story that ends in despair and presumably the suicide of the protagonist at the end of the last song. And then just a few years later, he reworks that material into the symphony, but with a totally different outcome. And in a way, it's no longer just, a broken heart, so I'm going to end it all. It's complete, utter defeat on every front, and then finding that little kernel of inner steel to build up to the final ending. And I think that's so unique in Mahler, that he can take texted music and find different meanings in it. So it's not just as simple as saying, oh, well, in the songs, this is about, walking in the field, so that's what it's about in the symphony. He's always finding complexity and leave you kind of wondering what that means. And I think that's something that you can see following right through the rest of his output, is that when he refers to another one of his works, sometimes he's referring to the text, sometimes he's referring to the music, and sometimes it's not at all clear, and you just have to really buckle down and engage with it. And I suppose that's the sort of challenge that must be inviting for you as a filmmaker, to get down in there and take the time to think about what the answers to these questions are.
It's interpretation, to be sure. I want to say that kernel that you refer to, that from the depths of despair leads to such a triumphant ending in the first symphony, as well as in the second, as well as in the third symphony, as well as in the eighth symphony, to be sure, is a redefinition of love. And in the first symphony, love is established pretty much as infatuation and recognized as such until it matures into something that is more life-informing. And that's autobiographical, in that Mahler and his romances with his opera singers are especially early on, but also universal in that we have crushes when we're young. This is part of what makes the blood pulse faster. It's part of our being, psychologically and physically. He understands all of this. He's such a psychologically deep person, not just philosophically deep. With regards to the songs, I think the texts that they come into being with are not left behind when he brings that music into his symphonic oeuvre. I think that they take on added meaning, to be sure. And so when we hear the main theme of the first movement, from the second song of the Wayfarer songs,
Ging heut Morgen übers Feld, da noch auf den Gräsern hing, sprach zu mir der lustige Fink,
This song is nothing short of miraculous. The theme, the structure, the breadth of expression. Talk about going into Technicolor all of a sudden.
We are probably meant to have that easygoing feeling of walking through a meadow, or just the feelings associated with that of a beautiful spring day. We're told spring without end. We feel that. But as we explore in the film, those of us who know where this melody comes from know that it doesn't lead to anything necessarily happy or good. When he brings back a theme from the fourth Wayfarer song in the Funeral March, it's devastating. And yet it's possibly one of the most beautiful themes he ever composed. It is just so beautiful. But what does it reference? It references lost love. And if we can't count on love to define the meaning of our life, if we can't rely on our connection to nature, which is undermined with the death, the funeral procession of the animals, what then have we? It takes a musical philosopher to answer that question. Fortunately, we've got one.
So Jason, before we wrap up, I want to thank you for taking time to talk to us. We could have spent several hours digging down this rabbit hole, but I hope you'll come back and do another one for us soon. I understand that you are setting up a streaming service, which will be a permanent home for all of these films. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about how they can access that?
Yes, we formed a not-for-profit company in order to create these films. And now we have a bunch of them, including a film on a biography of Henri Louis de Lagrange, which is called For the Love of Mahler. And so these have been available on DVD. Nowadays, people want immediate access and also in high definition. So we just established a streaming service. And so anyone with a computer at any time can watch any of these films in glorious stereo. Please have it hooked up to a good stereo system. And on Vimeo, the address is Cultural Media, which is the name of our production company, culturalmedia.net/streaming. And you'll see all the films there that can be streamed. Or you can buy the DVD at vaimusic.com or amazon.com. Thank you for asking that question.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot for talking, Jason, and we look forward to a sequel down the line very soon. Thank you.
A pleasure. Bye-bye.